Okay, we'll start in 20 seconds.
The logo on my shirt has to show.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Dave Vandenberg, Chair of NAFA's Transactional Integrity Working Group. We work to educate members about the risk of fraud, which can occur at any stage of a transaction, and provide resources that could help mitigate that risk. Please feel free to reach out at any time to ask questions or suggest topics for discussion for future webinars to info@nafa.aero. I'm pleased to present today's webinar on navigating Russian sanctions. I want to take a moment to thank the sponsors of today's webinar, TVPX and Lapa Oker Jet Council PA. TVPX is a leader in the global marketplace, providing a range of services with the highest levels of customer service for more than 20 years. TVPX is a licensed U.S. customs broker specializing in the import and export of business and commercial aircraft through U.S. Customs and Border Protection. TVPX also provides registration, trust, and tax services related to business aviation. Lapa Oker Jet Council PA has extensive experience with corporate aircraft, having attorneys with almost 40 years of collective experience that have served clients in the business aviation community. They can help navigate the tangled web of personalities, agendas, regulations, requirements, and issues involved with an aircraft purchase or sale of an orderly and efficient manner. Now I'll turn it over to our moderator, Stubert Lapa Oker, to start the webinar. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. David, that was probably the best fake of saying my last name, so congratulations. So just a little bit about myself. Our firm acts as Aviation Transaction Counsel to clients worldwide. David pretty much summed it up in his intro, so I'm not going to bore you with much more about us or about me. Let me ask our panelists to introduce themselves. Let's start with Cassia of Embraer.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. I'm here representing Embraer. Embraer is a big company, aircraft manufacturer, and we sell aircrafts in U.S. especially. And I'm in the trade compliance specialist, and we look for sanctions and applying the regulations in the due diligence process in our company when we review our customers, our potential customers. So I will be talking about a little bit about the navigation Russians with you.
We also have Carolyn Brown and Jeremy Lulian from Kroll and Mooring. Carolyn?
Thanks very much. I'm Caroline Brown. I'm a partner at Kroll and Mooring's Washington, D.C. office. I sit in both our white collar and regulatory enforcement and international trade groups. And my practice functions at the intersection of economic security and national security and international trade. Prior to joining the firm a few years ago, I served for well over a decade at the U.S. Department of Justice in the National Security Division, and then at the Treasury Department, where I worked on both economic sanctions and anti-money laundering considerations.
Okay, thank you. Welcome aboard. Jeremy?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jeremy Lulian. I'm a counsel at Kroll and Mooring in our Chicago office. I also am in the International Trade Department at Kroll and Mooring. I focus on export controls, economic sanctions, national security issues, and supply chain issues related to those types of topics, and specifically focusing on the overlap between technology and national security. And great to be here.
All right, thanks for being here. I just thought as a little bit of a primer, I know that there have been some webinars that NAFA's done about due diligence and some other things, but I thought it might be important to just have a baseline and let Carolyn and Jeremy get us through some information on some basics of really the source of the problems that we're going to be talking about today. So Tracy, let's go to the next slide.
Sure. So I'll take this first slide. So this is just a really basic overview of who sanctions apply to and who is subject to jurisdiction by the Office of Foreign Asset Controls, which is an office within the U.S. Department of the Treasury and is the primary sanctions, the primary minister of U.S. sanctions. So sanctions apply to U.S. persons, and you'll see that's in quotes on the slide, and that's because it has a very specific definition in the context of sanctions. So U.S. persons are, those entities or companies that are incorporated in the United States. Anybody who is physically located in the United States, and those individuals who are ordinarily resident in the U.S. or who are U.S. citizens, no matter where they're located, right? So those are U.S. persons in the context of sanctions. There are a couple of sanctions programs that also extend to foreign branches and subsidiaries of U.S. companies, and that's in the context of Cuba and Iran. Is not applicable to the Russia sanctions program. In addition to the definition of those individuals and companies that qualify as U.S. persons, there are certain occasions where sanctions can apply to non-U.S. persons. And of course, we usually see the great majority of sanctions applying against U.S. persons. One is where they themselves are the target of U.S. sanctions. The United States has put out what's referred to as secondary sanctions, where the U.S. has expressed a willingness to sanction non-U.S. parties because they're doing business with parties that the U.S. has either sanctioned or otherwise believes to be engaged in activities that are contrary to the national security of the United States. Typically, this involves designations for terrorism or assisting the facilitation of W&Ds, for example, but they are available in other contexts. And for purposes of this discussion, they are available in the context of Russia sanctions. Other ways that non-U.S. persons can be penalized includes under a theory of causation. And so that's when non-U.S. persons cause a U.S. person to violate U.S. sanctions. And this can be done both in a criminal context and in a civil context. More recently, we've seen OFAC impose penalties on non-U.S. persons that cause U.S. parties to violate sanctions in the civil context, oftentimes in the context of financial transactions. So, for example, if there is limited information regarding the processing of transactions on behalf of a sanctioned person or involving a sanctioned entity, OFAC can, find liability on those non-U.S. persons for causing the U.S. persons. In this example, would be the financial institution for violating sanctions. I think we can flip to the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
So jumping in here, the U.S. export control regime works in parallel to the U.S. sanctions regime. So as Caroline noted, U.S. sanctions apply based on if a U.S. person is involved or not. And so that's a person-based jurisdictional question. U.S. export controls actually apply based upon the item that's involved. And items can be goods, software, or even just basic functioning such as technology, information that would reverse engineer a type of item. So thinking in the context of aircraft, the actual aircraft itself, the engine, the parts, the tools that you use to repair the parts, that's how jurisdiction can apply in the U.S. export control context. And U.S. export controls can apply in four settings. The first is if the item is made in the United States, it's U.S. origin. The second is if it's sent from the United States. So, right, if is from Canada, it goes to the United States for repair, and then it's exported from the United States. Or it's sent through the United States, right? It's sent from Canada to Mexico through the United States. A third category is if a certain percentage of the actual item is made using U.S. origin stuff. So if it's made in Germany or France, but it's using a U.S. origin engine or a U.S. origin computer chip, it could be caught in that capacity. And the last one, and the one that's become most famous for its controls on Huawei and other Chinese companies in Russia, is the Foreign Direct Product Rule, which says even if it's made outside the United States, even if it's made with non-U.S. components, that if the technology and software that is used as the origin for the entire product and item itself is US technology or US software, or the machines that are making it are US origin or US technology, then that item that is made outside the United States based on that US technology and software is also controlled. And these restrictions can apply in a couple different ways. It can depend on where the product is going. If it's going to Russia or a place like Iran or Canada or something like that. If it's going to somebody that's on a restricted party list, famous someone being, Huawei's on a restricted party list, Vladimir Putin is now on a restricted party list, or if it's going for a particular type of use. So if it's an item that is typically used in civilian aircraft, but you know or have reason to know that it's going to be used by the Russian military, that can impose a different type of control. And so the reason we mention this is that these are parallel regimes with US sanctions, and that in many cases it's important that you look at both regimes. And in the Russia context, this has become absolutely crucial. Moving over to the next slide, we have a menu here of the types of controls the United States and other countries in coordination with the United States, like the UK and EU, have imposed on Russia. And so that first one that's highlighted in red is nearly all items are restricted. So at this point, most items that we just talked about previously, with a handful of exceptions for very basic components such as paper plates, screws, nuts, bolts, things like that that are very generic. Those types of things are still not restricted for Russia, but almost everything else is at this point that has some technological component with it. One piece of that is something here that's called General Prohibition 10. That is a rule under US export controls that says if something has been or will be exported in violation of US export controls, then that item is now essentially tainted. So if you think about, if you have a Boeing manufactured plane, so a plane made in the United States or made with US origin technology, that's a plane that is still subject to US export controls, even if it was sent to a place like Russia or Germany 10 years ago. If someone is using that plane to fly from one location in Russia to another location in Russia today, that may be a prohibited export. So if you are aware of that prohibited activity, that plane now may be tainted for use in most instances under US export controls. I'll turn it back to Caroline to talk about some of the other controls here that might be relevant for the aviation sector.
Yeah, we can go ahead and flip to the next slide. So one of the blocks on the previous slide was a number of persons that have been listed, right? And so then we start to think about what sort of list do we need to pay attention to when we're evaluating restrictions, either export control restrictions or OFAC, sanctions restrictions. And so the big one here is one that most of this audience is probably familiar with, is the SDN list, right? Or the Specially Designated Nationals and Blocked Persons list. And what this list means is if you are added to it, this includes both corporate entities and natural persons and also aircraft, right? Then U.S. persons are essentially prohibited from having any dealings, whatsoever with those SDNs, right? Or those listed entities. Another type of list, again, these are all administered by OFAC, is the sectoral sanctions list, or the SSI list. And this list, unlike the SDN list, which indicates that those persons are subject to blocking sanctions, the sectoral sanctions list includes, those persons that OFAC has identified as operating in certain sectors of the Russian economy here, identified by the Treasury Secretary. And so those are more limited than blocking sanctions, but are certainly, entities that need to undergo additional scrutiny as well. One quick note that is important to remember is that entities can also be sanctioned pursuant to what is called the 50% rule. And what this means is that an entity might not necessarily be listed on the SDN list, but if it is owned 50% or more by a sanctioned person or a combination of sanctioned persons, then that entity is itself also treated as sanctioned. And so this is, oftentimes we see that entities might not be identified as being subject to sanctions because there has to be some additional ownership diligence done, but it's important to flag as something to consider when you're conducting your diligence. Just a quick nod, Jeremy mentioned that the EU and the UK, have their own set of prohibitions as well. One thing to note is that in the context of Russia, this is the first time, this is often said, that we are seeing the major sanctioning authorities, with the exception of the UN, operating in concert, all in an effort to change behavior. And so the EU, the US, and the UK have taken a very coordinated approach to Russia sanctions. Yet there are still some differences, and we won't go into detail on those, but anything that is involving Russia sanctions that may have touch points to those jurisdictions will need to undergo an analysis, not only under US sanctions, but also UK and EU sanctions as well. And I'll pass the mic back to Jeremy to talk through the export control lists that are different than the OFAC lists.
Just having to, there we go. I'm going to go off mute for a minute.
Yeah.
So essentially, the export control lists are a little more nuanced than the sanctions lists, which have broader prohibitions associated with them. They're explicitly tied to a party to a party exporting one of the items that's subject to the EAR to a person on the list. We're not going to go through each of those lists, just because when the time comes and you're doing your basic diligence, you'll identify parties in theory that are on those lists. But the important point to note is that unlike the sanctions list, which Caroline noted are the 50% rule, there's no such 50% rule for the export control list in the United States. You must be on the list itself to be controlled by it. There's one nuance with that, which is the military end user list. That is only a identified set of military end users, not an exclusive set. So if you know, for example, that there is a party in Russia that is working with the Russian military, that person can be a military end user, even if the US government has not explicitly identified them. And with that, I think that might be a good segue to our next slide.
Yes, we're getting to Russia now.
So maybe just to start here with the overview of sanctions in the aircraft market, we talked about some of these types of restrictions that are applicable in the context of Russia, but maybe to dive in a little bit more, one of the points we noted a moment ago is with General Prohibition 10, where these rules and regulations still apply even if the item is no longer in the United States. So if you have a piece of aircraft that's in Russia, that it's possible that aircraft has been exported or re-exported or transferred within Russia in violation of those rules. And so that's how these types of rules can still apply, even if you have no US person involved, even if you're not physically located in the United States. And so when you're thinking about how the aircraft may be operating, inside of Russia, understanding where it's traveled, that type of control can still apply across the board, even though there's that nexus and tie to the United States or a place like Europe or the United Kingdom has been broken at that point.
Are we back? Okay.
Yeah.
Jeremy? Okay. All right. Sorry, we had a bit of a hiccup there.
Oh, sorry. Just to continue, and then I'll turn it over to some of the other panelists if they want to give any additional feedback here. Some of the other controls that are mentioned here that we haven't talked about in greater detail are there are certain import controls and other types of restrictions upon bringing in certain raw materials from Russia. So for aircraft manufacturers, you may have noticed this, that prices of aluminum and steel have shifted and changed over the last year or two because these new controls are in place. And there's certain regimes that now are required, particularly from the European side, if you're going to import steel and aluminum that may have Russian origin elements within them, and to receive certifications that it's not in there. It's not directly tied to owning an aircraft, but if you're manufacturing parts associated with them, this can impact that type of activity.
So let's go to the next slide and let's talk to Cassia from Embraer. Let me ask you, what is the manufacturer's perspective on for example, a prospective buyer who comes to Embraer to acquire a new aircraft?
So based on the explanations that my friends have provided here about how those sanctions and the export restrictions applies, we have to review our potential customers in terms of understanding how the aircraft will be operated, who will be responsible for providing the services and support for such aircraft. If we are talking about an aircraft from a market, we have to think about where this aircraft has flew, and to trigger, to find if we have any prohibition that has been imposed to that aircraft because it failed to comply with the regulation as well. So
you're talking about if you're taking in an airplane on trade, you have to worry about the airplane. For a new aircraft, you're more worried about the buyer and
exactly
who he or she is, who the beneficial owners are, where they're going to be operating the airplane, and how.
Yeah, exactly. And for that, we have to implement some additional due diligence process to review the buyer, and the connection is not only for who is a buyer, but the ultimate beneficial owner of the aircraft, right? The operator of the aircraft, to make sure that we don't trigger any sanctions, especially not only including SDN person or company, but also looking for the issue connected to Russia nationalities, because we have considered that Russian national is considered embargo under these restrictions, not only inside of Russia, but outside of Russia as well. So the nationality was one point of concern that we have to trigger and to identify, right, on the due diligence process, to understand if we have any risks connected to the sanctions.
I mean, I think it's a very sensitive position to be in, because on the one hand, you have salespeople, or you have the organization that wants to sell the airplane, and then you're asking questions. And since I've been through it with clients, there is, even for innocent people, there is some resistance to providing a considerable amount of detailed information to get you comfortable.
Yeah, exactly. And that's very good to have some concepts here connected to why we do this kind of questions, right? Because it's not because we suspicion on a person, on a company. It's because we have to have the proper evidence that we have done the proper diligence process review, right? To make sure that we have not skipped any risks on the process. So, and that's why we created like a checklist with questions and answers that we have asked our customers to fill out, and keep those records as an evidence that we have done the checks, right? So we asked this: what is the ultimate beneficial owner? What is the company's breakdown, ownership, to trigger if we have any connections, because we have seen that sometimes the connection is in a lower level, right? It's not directly visible on the first level of board or company's ownership. It's under the breakdown of the ownership of the companies. And that's why we also ask a ownership breakdown on the process to understand if we have connections on the lower levels.
And I think it's important to note that you're asking everyone the same questions. You're not differentiating, at least for the first set of basic questions. They may lead you other places, but it's all the same. You're not. It's not really an intention to offend anyone.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good question. We ask basic information for our potential customers and new customers. Of course, for certain countries, which is not signatory of US and European Union sanctions, we go over and ask more details, because we identified that we have higher risk for not being signatory of such sanctions. So Based on that, depending on the country where the company is located, we ask some additional documents and evidence as a way to go a little bit deeper on the checks.
So we're going to go into a couple of other topics, but we are going to get into some war stories, some examples that probably are very common. Maybe a couple are not so common. But, from my perspective, at least with respect to acquiring a pre-owned aircraft that's perhaps owned by a foreign seller. Just to note that as of October 2023, there were over 300 aircraft frozen, I'll say frozen, as a result of U.S. export controls. In other words, that touched Russia in some way. OFAC has 375 aircraft on that list. And I think, a buyer's perspective is that they're presented with a great deal. They're excited to get their aircraft or to buy an aircraft. They're presented with a great deal. Initially, there just may not be this thought of digging in to the seller or the history of the aircraft. Why would I care where it stopped while it was flying? Those questions tend to get some resistance when the parties, or at least the client, the broker, they're trying to, sign up a letter of intent, for example. I think it's important to look at the aircraft's history of operation, obviously obtain detail about the beneficial owners, even up front, even to include something in your letter of intent that you will deliver that immediately after the non-binding letter of intent, so you can get out of it if there tends to be a problem. Some companies won't even sign the letter of intent before, large public companies usually are very highly regulated, might not even sign a letter of intent without getting that KYC first. And I think, many aircraft are held by what we would refer to as shell companies formed in jurisdictions that don't really have a lot of transparency. You see a number of, we've seen obviously transactions where the aircraft's owned by a Cyprus company, almost impossible to get any information. There's some obviously jurisdictions in the Caribbean, et cetera, same issues. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as there's no resistance to getting the KYC and you get it. So let me ask Jeremy some of the basic threshold questions when looking to buy an aircraft that may have been overseas or owned by non-U.S. individual or company, at least to flesh out whether you're wasting your time. Sort of high level, let's get these out of the way before we really start spending a lot of time and energy.
Sure. I'll add a couple pieces here, and I think Caroline might have another.
Let's go to the next slide, Tracy. Okay.
Perfect. So the first question I would ask and I would think about is, where's your aircraft travel? Give me the flight logs. Where's your engine been? Give me the engine repair history. Give me the engine transaction history. And the reason that you want to look at these two things is because you want to understand where these items have been. Because if they have been to places like Russia, if they have been to places like Cuba, which is authorized under EU laws, but not US laws, if they have been to these locations, then that could pose a general prohibition 10 issue in export control rules. And that list that Stuart was mentioning, about 300 plus aircraft that the US Department of Commerce has identified as being controlled or as being restricted because of export controls, it could be the same as one of those aircraft on the list, and the US Department of Commerce has just not known about it or just not identified it. The US Department of Commerce has been fairly aggressive in going after Russian, particularly oligarchs, but other Russian individuals that are using these aircraft and these engines in violations of these laws. And so what you don't want to do is to find out throughout this whole process that you're doing your diligence, you've had your negotiations, you're working with the banks to get financing, with the insurance companies, and at the very end, you check out the flight logs and it turns out someone flew to Cuba or someone flew to Russia, right as the war broke out, and the plane is tainted. You've got to go get a license because the licensing process can take a few months at minimum. And so that's kind of the first initial question. Where has this plane been? Where has the engine been? And have any of those places been locations that would be prohibited to go to under U.S. export control laws?
Right. And, go ahead. I'm sorry, Carolyn.
Well, I was just going to add to that from the sanctions perspective, from the OFAC perspective. The first stop is figuring out who is the seller, right, and who's involved in the transaction, who's also servicing the plane, and who are all the parties that might touch the plane or the aircraft, in order just to do that basic due diligence about whether or not they are themselves sanctioned persons. And again, this kind of goes to what you were talking about before about collecting, doing the KYC and collecting the related information to determine not only whether or not those parties are themselves sanctioned or on the SDN list, but also whether they might be sanctioned pursuant to that 50% rule that we were talking about. Another quick distinction to make, and we've actually seen this, is, to the extent that it has a touch point, it might be a U.S. buyer, right? But say the aircraft is somewhere in the UK, you're going to have a touch point, that's going to evoke UK jurisdiction. And they also consider who has control over the aircraft. The United States is based on ownership and not control. The UK is based on control. And so that's where peeling back the onion on the ownership to find out who is, as Cassia saying, you're looking for the ultimate beneficial owner. That's very important for purposes of those analyses. So just wanted to flag that. And with that, I'll pass it back to you.
And talk to me about the end user statement. We see those, we're starting to see those a lot now being exhibits to the purchase agreements. My view is, tell me who's going to use it. I want something in writing so that I can hold that up when the DOJ, Department of Justice, comes knocking at my door to see whether I've at least exercised reasonable diligence in trying to figure out who I'm selling the airplane to.
Yeah, I think that's the exact right question. I think Cassia might have some more insight on this, but that's a foundational question at this point when you're dealing with these types of countries and aircraft that have touch points to a place like Russia, that you almost essentially have to get it, because if you don't, and it turns out there was even an inadvertent violation, that could be something that could be used against you in any type of enforcement case. All these U.S. government agencies have criteria for when a case becomes something that they'll say, oh, we'll give you a pass, this was an oops, versus a case that says, we're going to really issue the full penalty on you. And one of the criteria Stuart is mentioning is, have you done your diligence? But I would also like to say that, again, this is a foundational point. If you have a client that's in China that says they agree that they're not military end user and we're not somebody that's doing business with Russia, but you can go on Google and 5 minutes you see a press story from CNN that says, oh, this Chinese party is buying old aircraft and breaking them down and selling to the Russian military. Well, that's obviously a red flag. And so it's thinking about things like that in that context. It's the paperwork, but also what are you doing, with common sense to understand the risk profile.
And also, to think that someone isn't going to find out that you did that search and should have seen what popped up on your screen. Believe me, there are ways that they find that. They know exactly where you're looking. They know exactly where you're going on the internet. They know what you've seen, and that can be used as a negative factor.
And complementing that, Stuart, that's why sometimes we make some questions in our forms, and sometimes we do additional questions, right? Depending on the red flags that we found out, we may ask additional information to substantiate, because we don't use only the document as a baseline, right? As Germany said, the document is helping for the review, but then not only the only way, right, to do the diligence. So
before we go too much further, I know we have a lot of people watching the webinar. There is an opportunity to in StreamYard to ask questions in the comment section. We are keeping an eye on those, and so we'll try to answer those as we go. I don't think we're going to wait till the end to do all those questions. So if something comes up and you just can't resist, go ahead and pop a question into the comment section, and we'll try to answer it in our flow. So let's look at a few what I call war stories, hypotheticals, to really keep it real for everyone. And the first one I want to talk to Cassie about, and it's frankly something that we've seen fairly recently. You know, let's assume you have a buyer who's had an airplane on order for quite some time, and obviously the airplane needs to be constructed. It could take a couple years before it closes. And then when you get close to closing, there is the buyer would like to assign the agreement or sign the contract to someone else, and they may propose it as an affiliate. Let's set aside whether the manufacturer has restrictions about doing that and all this sort of thing. But what is that? What kind of bells does that ring for you? How do you determine whether that subsequent assignee or that buyer number 2 is clear to buy the airplane?
We will do the same review as the original buyer, right? Because we consider that the assignee will assume the responsibilities for the use of the aircraft. So the assessment should be done again. Sometimes it's a little difficult, like close to the delivery, right, to do it, but it's necessary. So the documents and all the information required for doing the review will be also applicable to the assignee.
So you're starting again.
Yes.
Yeah. And in that context, you will have received, I don't know, some large percentage of progress payments. And so the assignment, and I'll throw this out to Carolyn and Jeremy as well. Maybe Carolyn, because I know you're involved in some money laundering and other things, but the assignment of the purchase agreement would mean that they're also assigning any rights to any progress payments, which means somehow buyer number 1 had to get paid by buyer number 2. And does that raise any concerns for any of you?
Well, I think, again, we want to always make sure that we run the diligence on, all the parties that are involved, right? So easy thing to do, reach out to your friendly sanctions counsel, ask them to do the diligence to see if they're subject to sanctions in any jurisdiction. Again, I think it's always important to check all of the jurisdictions and not just the United States, because you never know if there's going to be a touch point to another jurisdiction, and that's helpful. And make sure that you've got a clean bill of health when it comes to the sanction status of those individuals or those companies. And one thing to point out too is just how fluid these lists are. When we're talking about war stories or things we've seen, this actually came up, in the context of Russia sanctions. We were working on a deal, a transaction, and in the course of just working out the negotiations, an owner of the plane, of the aircraft, became sanctioned, right, by 2 of the 3 jurisdictions. And so, had we not been monitoring that throughout the course of the negotiations, that could have been, very easily missed by the time we got to signing, because that had not been the case when we first started negotiations. And so, especially when it comes to Russia sanctions, OFAC is updating the SDN list on a regular basis. And it also works in the other direction. I was actually just this morning reviewing a delisting of several aircraft and a Russian entity that was involved with those planes. I think it was about a month ago, right? And so it's possible that the aircraft and the entities can come off of the SDN list, right? That's going to change status as well. So important to keep an eye on those things.
So let's look at an analysis of something. You have a pre-owned aircraft being sold by an unsanctioned Russian seller. In other words, someone who's Russian, but they're not sanctioned. What's your analysis? What are the consequences? What are your recommendations?
Sure. So I think this actually is a good segue to one of the questions here that's in the the comment from.
Oh, we got one. Great.
Yes. And so it says when reviewing, I'll read it out for everybody. It says when reviewing flight logs, are we looking for specific dates the aircraft may have visited Russia as a red flag, or if the aircraft has ever visited Russia at any point in its history? And so let's, again, as Stuart said, let's say the person's not sanctioned, they're not on a list, they're not owned or controlled by anyone on a list, they're not a front for anybody, just a regular, ordinary Russian person. Again, the primary concern is that they have used this aircraft or the engine or any of the components that are on the aircraft in violation of U.S. export controls. So the first question is, right, is that aircraft subject to U.S. export controls? In almost every context, it will likely be, given how the aircraft industry works, how parts are developed, how technology is shared, where the major manufacturers are. It's most likely going to be subject to U.S. export controls because some technology component engine is going to have some U.S. tie to it. So then the second question is, okay, has that aircraft ever been exported in violation of the controls? Now, the controls on general commercial aircraft with respect to Russia have only been in place essentially from February, March 2022. So if an aircraft is in Germany, let's say, and you notice the flight logs that it traveled to Russia in 2019, that may very well be okay, and it likely will be. Now, there's some hiccups and nuance in there, right? If they say it's in Russia, but it's in Crimea, which Russia says is part of Russia, that's been prohibited since 2014. So there's some nuances in all of that, but that's the kind of first level consideration we would make here, right? Where has this aircraft been? When it visited those locations, was it okay to visit those locations? Now, if you're dealing with something that's a little more advanced than a standard commercial aircraft, that it has certain enhancements to it, it could be subject to greater controls, and then travel to Russia may have been restricted for many years. And a host of other countries might be caught in that too. But that's the kind of consideration you're thinking about when you're looking at a party that's a non-sanctioned, non-export restricted Russian party that's trying to offload their aircraft. Is that aircraft even able to be purchased or touched by someone due to U.S. export controls?
So let me ask Cassia, obviously Embraer has service centers all over. How are, and let's say an aircraft is brought into pre-buy, there's parts that the customer is requesting under one of the service programs, the parts programs, and you have an unsanctioned Russian, but Russian nonetheless. How are the service centers or the service programs dealing with that situation?
Yeah, that's like Jeremy said, we look for the history of the flights of the aircraft to Russia, additionally to the new owner, right, or the new customers that are going to ask for the support as well. And one quite question that is usual to come to us is, can't we fly to Russia because it's part of our diligence questions, or have you been to Russia right after the sanctions? And customers sometimes come to us and ask, oh, but can't I go to Russia? So that's a key point, right? Because there is an exception under the US export regulation that permits flights to Russia, but in a short period of time and not in beneficial of a Russian person. So we used to not say that it's allowed freedom because it keeps give a chance that they believe that it's okay, right? But when customers ask us, we explain that they need to follow the conditions, right? And it's under their own risks as well. So,
and let me ask the group. I mean, I can see where people may try to be somewhat creative, to for lack of a better term, where you've got a sanctioned person, Russian or otherwise, in the chain of ownership. You may not necessarily be buying from that person, but they're there. They're in the history of the airplane. What's the analysis?
You mean when we have a Russian in the ownership
chain?
If you're,
let's say, well, I mean, for Jeremy, if we're buying an airplane and the seller is perfectly fine, but there is some history prior to that person's ownership. What's the concern there?
Yeah, great. And so it's the same type of issue that we're thinking about, right? Has this airplane or the engine or any of its parts been exported in violation of the rules previously? And so if you have someone who's on one of these lists, that it may have been prohibited for them to receive the airplane initially or the engine initially, and so that would taint the rest of the aircraft. The other consideration, which Caroline can probably speak to in greater detail as well, is that if someone is sanctioned part of this chain, and you notice that the aircraft was sold right around when they were sanctioned, or maybe right before or right after, and it's some weird Cayman Islands entity or Dubai entity that's part of this process, are they really not in control of the airplane anymore? Is it really not theirs? And so that's where you want to do more due diligence and make sure that 50% rule is still not in effect, even if the information is not telling you that.
Yeah,
That's
well,
the
just for purposes of just anecdotes, we've observed several situations where, literally minutes, hours after, some entity is sanctioned, we start to see a shifting, right, of the percentage of ownership, right? So it might be 49.9% owned by sanctioned entities, whereas the day before it had been, 75% owned, for example, right? So it's there's a lot of 2Q by half movement of ownership shares. One other note that I just wanted to point out quickly is that there's some, and I'd love to hear Cassia's comments on this as well. There's some practical realities when you're dealing with these sorts of deals and negotiations that might not necessarily be prohibited pursuant to sanctions or restricted pursuant to export controls, but it's just kind of part of the current environment surrounding the sanctions related to Russia. And that's, considering, is your banking partner going to process the payments, right, for the transactions? It could be that, they have their own sanctions compliance programs and their own tolerance for risk and different risk tiers. And, they are going to conduct their own due diligence. And if they're not comfortable processing that transaction, they could certainly, elect not to, right? And so one thing to think about is, are your banking partners going to be able to process the payments related to the transaction? Relatedly, if there's, Cassia, you can probably speak to this better than I can, but, if the aircraft needs servicing, even if it's not sanctioned itself and it's not subject to sanctions, is there going to be some sort of stigma surrounding servicing that aircraft that might present certain operators from some servicing the plane so that it's not actually, so that you can't change the plane's location, for example, something as simple as that. But there's a lot of, as I'm sure this audience is fully aware of, there's a lot of hesitation about dealing with anything that has some sort of nexus to Russia. And so even if it is legally permissible, it could very well be that the parties are reluctant to engage in other services that they, can do legally, but they just choose not to out of an abundance of caution.
Lawyers, at least I say, we can write an agreement that's 100 pages long, but bad people are going to do bad things. And, to get a certificate and have it certified by another officer, that's one person lying and the other one swearing to it. That, from a KYC perspective helps us, but in terms of other people thinking we were involved somehow, but I don't know that you can defend against that kind of activity.
Yeah, and then a good example, sometimes, not very often, but sometimes, we ask the customer to go directly to the Department of Commerce and ask for an advisory opinion, because it's not only us doing that for them, but themselves need to be responsible for what they are planning to do is already authorized, right? So we have seen some situations that the customers want us to say yes, and based on a critical situation, we ask them go directly to the Department of Commerce.
Let me ask you a quick question. So you have an airplane after February of 22, and it went AOG in Russia. It was down. It had a mechanical, needed to landed at an airport, needed some maintenance, needed to then left. Where are we?
Yeah. When customers ask if they can fly to Russia, we said we cannot provide support in Russia. So if you flew to there, it's your own responsibility. So if it happens, we cannot provide support.
Okay, but
in Russia.
in terms of later, so obviously the airplane's down. Let's say they're there for a week, 10 days, and then it flew out, and you're looking back on the flight logs, and the only thing you see about touching Russia is this period, and they had to land because otherwise they were going to crash. I mean, something like that. What's the view of what would be the analysis there if you were buying that airplane?
That's a good question. I think I would suggest to request a Prohibition 10 waiver to BIS with the explanation for the reasons why it happens. I don't know, Jeremy, what would...
No, I think that's exactly where that's my first reaction. There, as Cassia mentioned, there are a narrow set of license exceptions that are available for parties that are engaging in temporary sojourn, basically very brief in and out parts of Russia where no Russian nationals involved. We'd want to look at the specific facts to see if that met some of the criteria that was in place, because don't forget, the question is whether or not was there a historic violation. So it would have to be, were the criteria met at the time of the violation, supposedly.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily what the rule is today, but what the rule is back then. And those license exceptions have narrowed as the war has gone on because folks are generally understanding flying to Russia is a risk. But in the immediate moments after the Russian invasion, there was still some workings by the Department of Commerce to figure out whether or not certain license exceptions would work and how they'd be tailored. And so I think that's the kind of takeaway is right as Cassie said, you're probably going to end up in a universe where you might need to get a waiver from the Department of Commerce, but there are some narrow exceptions that could apply. And to echo what Caroline said earlier in the call your outside counsel and have them help you work through everything.
And that's a great way to come to closure on the webinar. It's about all the time we have. Thank you, Cassia, Paula, Caroline, and Jeremy for an outstanding discussion, helping us all better understand the complexities around Russian sanctions. Watch for information on NAFA's next due diligence and transactional integrity webinar coming this fall. Due diligence is everyone's job, and these webinars will benefit everyone on your team who is part of the due diligence process. Make sure you mark your calendar for the next one and invite everyone from your team who you think can benefit from this series. To check out recordings of past webinars, visit NAFA's transaction integrity page on its website at www.nafa.aero, AERO, under the News and Articles tab. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.